Hi, my name's Kayla Austin, and thank you so much for inviting me to come talk with you guys about one of the most amazing neighborhoods in our community, Norwood and Lovetown. Uh, these two neighborhoods are twin neighborhoods. They were established at the same time in the 1870s. And, I grew up just outside of their boundaries in Gray's Tuxedo Park. So the part of Indianapolis that I'm working in and on behalf of is also the community that I was raised in, and it keeps the story really close to my heart because Norwood and Lovetown and their existence here in Indianapolis is the reason why I am who I am, because they have always been here. So Norwood and Lovetown, yet again, twin communities, sit at the intersection of the big four railroads at the southeast corner of Indianapolis. These two railroads, they're the North and South Line and the East and West Line, and they are what makes us the crossroads of America here in Indianapolis. So Norwood is to the north, and Lovetown, now known as Barrington, is to the south. Both of these communities were founded by the U.S. colored troops in the late 1860s, the early 1870s, and they are still maintained by their descendants now, 150 years later. Founded in 1872, Norwood and Lovetown are celebrating their 150th anniversary now in 2022, making them one of the oldest Black neighborhoods in the United States. Just as old as Harlem in New York and Utown in Washington, D.C., or Atlanta. So a pretty spectacular find, and none of the history of Norwood or Lovetown is included in our state archives and has very minimal information about these two very prominent African American communities here. The story of Norwood and Lovetown, however, actually starts in Fountain Square. So Fountain Square was the home of the 28th Regiment. This is Indiana's only division of the U.S. colored troops for the Union Army. Camp Fremont is located off of Shelby Street on the Calvin Fletcher farm. And if you're familiar with the area, Calvin Fletcher Coffee Shop, Bluebeard, and then Amelia's Coffee Shop, right? This is called, the street to the south of Amelia's is called Norwood Street. And right there is the marker for the 28th Division, our only regiment of the U.S. colored troops. So this history is very deeply embedded in this place. The U.S. colored troops were mustered in November of 1863. Most of the men were drafted. We were having difficulties in the state of Indiana meeting our enrollment numbers for the Civil War. And so they created the 28th Division, and they drafted in most of the Black men in the state of Indiana. So as far as we can find, there were 6 companies, and it was somewhere between 500 and 1,000 men. We've not located the muster rolls, which is the military documentation of who was in the regiment. That's one of our goals for this next year. So most of the 28th were not actually from Indiana. They were actually from Kentucky. They were recently emancipated. The Emancipation Proclamation had passed in January 1st of 1863. And in the 11 months before the 28th is established, there was a rapid influx of recently freed African Americans to the southeast quadrant. Yet again, we're talking about the intersections of the Big Four Railroad. There's actually only one line at that time. But so there's a lot of African Americans recently emancipated from Kentucky that are in the southeast quadrant of Indianapolis already. They kind of recruit all of these soldiers, these citizens, to become soldiers. James Hinton is one of the officers of the 28th Division. He goes on to become the first African American legislature for the state of Indiana. So the 28th is producing very exceptional men, or rather, very exceptional men are joining the 28th. So in April of 1864, the 28th has been fully trained and mustered in, and they are sent out to Washington, D.C., and they are there for the Battle of Washington. They are later sent down to Petersburg, Virginia for the Battle of Crater, where about half of them are lost. The Battle of Crater is an epic loss for the Union Army. The game plan was they were going to dig a tunnel under the city of Petersburg, Virginia, send the black troops in to light the dynamite with the intention of leaving them down there. The black troops clearly don't agree to this, and they go to leave. However, they still lose about half of the 28th Division. So yet again, this is most of the black men in the state of Indiana at the time. They continue onward after the Battle of Crater, and they are there for the Siege of Richmond in early April of 1865 and are in Richmond for the surrender of Robert E. Lee on April 9th, and which is also my birthday, on April 9th, and are there as the Civil War ended. So the 28th is a pretty remarkable story all in itself, and definitely look forward to more history of that regiment coming out over the course of the next year. 2023 will be the 160th anniversary of the establishment of the 28th Regiment. The war ends, and the 28th is sent out to Corpus Christi, Texas, where they assist with the American Indian Wars. And it is a pretty tragic scene for the black soldiers there. About half of them die of malnutrition and scurvy, meaning that by the time the 28th gets back to Indiana, there's only about a quarter of them left. So in some ways, this starts off as a pretty heartbreaking story. But the U.S. colored troops return home. They are mustered out on January 6th of 1866. And they receive a ceremony in which there's no documentation that we can currently find. But we're looking for it. This is a growing project. The U.S. colored troops return home. The veterans from Indiana return to Ransom Place. They return to Evansville. They go back to Anderson, Terre Haute, the communities that they've established, right? However, the veterans from Kentucky have no homes to return to. These are all emancipated slaves. So emancipated captured peoples. They set up homes and businesses around the boundaries of Camp Fremont, where the 28th Regiment was, to the point that the Prospect Street, right off of Shelby, where the fountain is, became known as the Black Business District of Indianapolis up until the 1960s. And there are many structures that were built by the U.S. colored troops that are still there. One of the prominent ones was built by Reverend Sidney Pinnock, one of the founders of Norwood. He had, in 1879, he establishes the Lovely Lane Chapel in the attic of a blacksmith shop, right on Shelby Street where Wildwood Market is currently. And so they have an original structure that's built there. It's torn down in 1906, and it's moved further down on Shelby, right on the other side of Pleasant Run, and it's called St. Mark. It's a big yellow Art Deco church. It's real cute, and the congregation is still there. Reverend Sidney Pinnock also starts the Pinnock Chapel over in Norwood in 1889, and goes on to start Caldwell AME Zion out in Hawville as well. So Ransom Place and Norwood and Lovetown and Camp Fremont have a very close-knit relationship where Ransom Place pretty much acts as their mother city. So Norwood proper was established at the end of the Civil War, and at the very latest in 1872. So James Hinton, who we mentioned, was one of the officers for the 28th Division, stops in Norwood in 1872 on a campaign stop for the Republican National Convention. Back then, the Republican Party is still the party of Lincoln, so it's kind of a different story than it is now. But he stops on a campaign stop at the Norwood Colored School in 1872. And this is where we're getting 1872 as the birth date of both of these communities. Because the laws only changed that allow African Americans to have public schools in Indiana in 1871. So for them to have a school by 1872 and for them to be a large enough voting population for a campaign stop implies that this is a very organized community, that they are very well versed in strategic activism, right? They know how to advocate for themselves. And these are both very important for the development of their community and one of the main reasons why they are still established today. And as I've been saying, Norwood and Lovetown, right at the intersections of the Big Four Railroad. Norwood's to the north and Lovetown's to the south. Lovetown's now, yet again, known as Barrington. So Norwood is for families. By 1899, and definitely before annexation in 1912, Norwood and Lovetown stood as their own independent cities. And as such, they had all of the resources needed to be a functioning city, because Indianapolis ends at Keystone during this time period. So by 1899, Norwood's elementary school population has gone from 6 students to 150, based almost solely on the work of a woman from Ransom Place named Ada Harris, which we will get more into. Ada Harris is a whole story all of herself. But she becomes the principal of the Norwood Colored School in 1889. By 1899, there are 150 students. The city has to come in and build another unit, another room onto their one-room schoolhouse. And by 1903, Indianapolis has to come in and build the Harriet Beecher Stowe School, which was at the time the largest colored school in the county. And we have photos of it at its opening ceremony, and it's pretty beautiful. In 1908, they established the Norwood Community Center. It was their boys' club. It's now known as Pride Park. And in 1912, they established the Norwood Library. This is the first African-American library in the city of Indianapolis. And they hire the first African-American librarian. So Norwood is 110 years ago, breaking boundaries that we are now revisiting all of this time later. So Norwood and Lovetown are still occupied by their descendant communities. It's a pretty beautiful thing. So there are at least, in Norwood, 201 lots. There are, Norwood proper, there are at least 10 to 15 descendant families still living on the ancestral lands that their grandparents and great-grandparents purchased back in the early 1870s and 80s. And because of this, Norwood and Lovetown are one of the oldest descendant-led Freetowns in the United States. You know, a Freetown is described as a community that is built by recently emancipated African Americans during the Reconstruction period. And nearly all of the founders of both of these communities were U.S. colored troops. There is a cemetery in Lovetown called New Crown Cemetery. It was modeled after Crown Hill on 38th Street. It opens in 1899, and it is a very common resting place for African Americans in this quadrant of the city. So Wes Montgomery is buried in there. Bill Gaither and Scrapper Blackwell, these prominent black jazz musicians, right? But there are also at least 10 to 15 U.S. colored troops in this cemetery, and an infinite number more to be found. So I suppose this is an invitation to dig a little bit deeper, to keep your ear to the ground, and to listen more for news about Norwood and Lovetown and what they've been capable of doing in our community, and what they continue to do even today. Thank you.